that? Snow. Yeah. It is actually taken fairly near where the demo jam is. It's at least in the same city. It's Prague. All right, good afternoon, good morning, whatever it is. My name is Liam Quin with the World Wide Web Consortium, and I have a slightly strange talk today. It will be a lot less strange if... There we go. All right. Improving text quality with automatic majority editions, otherwise known as making OCR more awesome. This originally came from a poster I put up at Balasage, and a gentleman sitting over there, said he was very interested in this. And you can look away, Sid, but it's all your fault. And, and I spoke with a few other people, and they said, why don't you give a paper on it? So here we go. The idea is that we're all used to working with XML, and a lot of us have authors or we do conversions, but quite a few people I've spoken to are taking text files. And in fact, quite a few people I've spoken to are taking text files from places like Archiveorg or Google Books and turning them into ebooks or dealing with them in some other way. And it's a fun thing to do. And I wanted to have some texts in XML. I wanted to have some dictionaries that I could make use of and do interesting queries on. And in fact, originally I wanted them in SGML, and on a trip to Oxford in 1991, there's all these bookstores in Oxford. It's very dangerous. I bought a 32-volume set of encyclopedias of biography from 1810 up to about 1818, I think the last one was done. This is actually someone else's set. I meant to photograph mine before I came and forgot, but it looks very similar. So there's 32 volumes. They're each about 500 pages. And each page, there's 16,000 pages, roughly. It's not the Dictionary of National Biography, which was the Oxford Dictionary. It's Chalmers' Biographical Dictionary. It predates the Dictionary of National Biography by quite some time. But it is the same kind of thing, yes. Plus, this one talks more about people who were not actually from the UK. Which I'll show you a couple of pages. It doesn't really matter if you can't read this. This is just a picture of a page, a rough outline. But the thing to notice here is there's entries. The first one is Courtois, James and William C. Cortese. And the next one is for Gilbert Cousin. And it goes down nearly to the bottom, and there's a footnote giving the source. And then we have another entry beginning on the same page. So they're quite easy to find the entries if you're going through a text version of this, because you can look for capital letters at the beginning of the line. After a while, you'll notice at the very bottom, I've got volume 10, B1. Does anyone know what that is? Signature, yes. In the 19th century, actually it's still done today, if you look in many printed books, you'll find typically on every 16th or 32nd page, or if it's a larger book, every 8th page. On this one, it's every 16th. You'll find letters at the bottom, something like B1 and B2, B3. And that's so that the person who collates all those folded sheets of paper that we've printed on puts them in the right order. And they're very clever here. It's fairly unusual. They've actually put the volume number of the encyclopedia in as well, suggesting that they had multiple volumes in the printing house at the same time, but I don't know if that was true or not. Things like this are actually a pain when you OCR because they come in as part of the text, typically, and you have to get rid of them. But you can be clever and notice it's every 16th page. And all right, we don't need that one. So, I have in fact these days a museum quality flatbed scanner, which is an immense thing that can do A3 or tabloid, very accurate. And I did, in fact, try scanning a few pages and using Abby Fine Reader, and I found I got 1 to 3 errors per page with a little bit of work. Maybe 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes per page, maybe 1 or 2 minutes if you got practiced. But it would destroy the binding of the books and leave me with thousands of pieces of paper, which was a different kind of management problem I really didn't want. So I abandoned the project. And then one day I happened to discover that Google Books had scanned this set of encyclopedias. Now, what Google is doing is they're going to research libraries, and the deal with the research libraries made with Google is that the result would be placed on archive.org and available for free use. And these texts are well out of copyright, so anything that you find in there saying this is for non-commercial use only or is a load of baloney. And that has been tested in court and checked. But what they do is they go to a library shelf and they scan the whole shelf. They take all the books, they scan them, and they put them back, and then they do the next shelf, and then they carry on, at least conceptually. And meanwhile, in another university, in another city, they're doing the same thing in a different library. And it turns out that sometimes there's more than one copy. So I did a look on archive.org, and I found 157 files for this dictionary that only has 32 volumes. So that's an average of roughly 5 duplicates for each volume. So I said, okay, I downloaded them all over a period of several days. So click, click, click. And the metadata is really sucky. It doesn't tell you which volume in the metadata. So I sorted them into scan sets and by volume and checked that they were all the same edition, which they were because there was only one, which is interesting because it constantly talks about the previous edition of this work in footnotes, but in fact there wasn't one. And I chose the best of these 5 or 7 sets. It varied. Sometimes there were only 2, sometimes there was 7. And started a conversion project into XML, and it was all very exciting until I actually looked at the quality of the text in more detail and discovered it was really awful. And so I found, well, let's look at one. So there's the archive.org page, for example, for a search page, and you just get all of these. You can see the title saying the General Biographical Dictionary revised by A. Chalmers. Some of them have a slightly different version of the title. So you have to be kind of liberal in your keywords when you do the search. And I can't actually tell if there's any duplicate volumes in that one or not. I think there are on that page. So my initial conversion is was actually a set of Perl scripts. This was like a decade ago. And they do things like identify the running headers, and so to get the page boundaries and delete those signature marks. Delete the part where the Google operators have typed 00000, meaning it's time for lunch. I'm serious, you find this, and I actually did searches to discover what these series of O's meant that appear in Google Books, and it turns out it's communication between the camera operator and the scanner operator, the different people. I put these, time for lunch, time to go home. So conversion scripts do tons of tests, and I really want to emphasize this. So for example, each page is logged, and if we skip a page, then it prints an error message to a log file, and if we try and go back a page, then it aborts altogether and says, Liam, you've got to fix this. And in fact, that's how I know there's over 16,000 pages, because they're all accounted for. And then I had a brainwave, which was, why don't I match up corresponding lines of text in all these versions and choose the best one? So that is what I did. The easiest way to do that is, for some reason F11 doesn't work. I need to put my eyes on for a sec. So we could look at the script, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's very useful. But what I'll do instead is show you the result of running it. And then if anyone wants to, we'll look at the script a little bit. But what the script does is it runs through all the versions, a line at a time. Strictly speaking, this is if you've got 5 texts, the complexity of this is n to the 5th. But because it will never go more than 200 lines further down, which is about 4 pages, it actually runs in reasonable time. Complexity theorists would say that's silly, you're n to the 5th, and limiting it by 200 doesn't change that. But in practice, there's a big difference between 20,000 to the 5th and 200 to the 5th, which is the difference between about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes to run this and about 3 weeks. Right, I mean, so it runs reasonably quickly. And the way that I use it is it produces output, choosing the best version from each, choosing the majority version, rejecting ones that add certain specific OCR common errors. So a common error, for example, is having curly braces in the middle of the document. Let's make this big. Oh, a little bit bigger. So this is a diff output for just a standard Unix diff, comparing the original, which is lines with a less than sign at the start of the original and lines with a greater than sign of the replacement. We can see, for example, about the 5th line, we've got he afterwards spent some %VA GIMO. Well, that's no good. And it's replaced with he afterwards spent some time in Denmark. And I can't see the difference from here on the next line. It's probably a comma. Received. Upper and lower case. The first of those, the original has an uppercase R in received. I don't know why. It's possible that's a difference in the printed books. Even though it's the same edition, sometimes what happens is while they're printing the book, someone notices an error. And they've done 100 copies here, they've got 300 to go, and they get a pair of tweezers, they loosen up the form, take that one sort, that one piece of type out and put the right one in, tighten up the form and carry on. Right, and it's the same edition, these days it would be called the same impression, but there's a difference. If I was trying to do something really academically critical, I would go and check. But because of the level of errors in this, that's a pipe dream. And I'm never going to be able to do that myself. Here we've got, I did want to point out, here we've got col star should be CUL hyphen, so cultivated and cultivated. It is actually possible to use spell checkers, and Project Gutenberg has a program that tries to do that. I've tried to do it, but I found that there were too many differences, legitimate words that spell checkers hated, and too many problems. And a lot of that's just because there's so many proper names in this text. But for some texts, I do have a version of the script that can do spelling. Okay. So now we have done that, what do we do next? If I'm lucky. I want to talk a little bit about the context of using scripts like this, because you can get yourself in a big mess if you're not careful. So you've really got to be quite careful to make sure, for example, you've got all the variants are in a subdirectory all by themselves for each file. And you don't end up with multiple files around and you can't remember which is which a year later. It really helps to use a revision control system of some kind, which I didn't early on and regretted, because I normally do. I don't know why I didn't start out doing it. And then a week later I discovered I'd accidentally deleted all the semicolons in one of the files. Luckily I was able to put them back in programmatically, but it helps a lot. The way that I do conversions, and I know a lot of other people do them this way, is to have it's not unusual to have a dozen or even 2 dozen small scripts that you run in a pipeline. You can't use XProc1 because the stuff at the beginning is not XML. It's text with random angle brackets in it here and there, and XProc really doesn't like that. But you can use make, or you can write a shell script. If you're an MS-DOS, you can write a batch script, but I recommend make. Even if it's something, I guess yesterday Norm was showing us a version of make written with XProc, but then you have to deal with the markup in these Google texts is there's about 200 to 500 lines of crazy HTML metadata, which is mostly garbage, unfortunately, as far as I can tell anyway, and then a pre-tag, and then an entire book as ASCII text, and then an end pre-tag, and then end body, end HTML. That's what you get as input. And here and there may be, it may not even be well formed. So I have lots of small stages, and I manage those with make. So you run something that identifies pages, and that makes versions of the files with the page breaks marked. And then if you edit one of those files here, make says, you need to run that phase again. But if you're over here and you edit one of the scripts, for example, then make will say, I don't need to run this early stuff again. We can just go from here. And it doesn't save you a huge amount of time, but what it does is it makes a huge emotional difference because you can make a quick change to a script and you're not running everything from the beginning. And that should not be underestimated. And each stage, it's important, logs any problems. Ranging from my Saxon license has expired through to things like I've got a superscripted number on this page, but I can't find a footnote. And then I can go and look. There are not that many footnotes that I can fix those by hand. And you make a decision. At what point does the conversion stop and bail out and fail? And it's usually more useful if it can continue as much as possible and you get a result. So we should look at a result. And I think I have one that I prepared earlier. That's what they say, isn't it? Okay, you probably... let's scroll down. I had this vague idea that I would get rich off ads on these, but I should just take the ads off, like $1 a month or something. So here is the result of the OCR text with a footnote at the bottom, links to alternatives, and the thing at the top is SVG that's generated in the XSLT that splits the final XML into 10,000 small HTML files, one for each person mentioned, showing the born and showing birth and death and published works. And that's another check. If the published works are way after the death date, then sometimes you wonder were they published posthumously or is it an error? If these two blobs are too far apart, if they're more than 100 years apart, turns out there's only 3 people, I think, in the dictionary that lived to be significantly more than 100. Right, so you know that there's probably an OCR error in the death date, and that does happen sometimes. Someone has a death date of with a 7 instead of a 1 at the beginning or something. And they lived a long time. All right. I've almost witted on. I'm sure I have witted on too long. I don't know. How am I doing for time? Someone? Anyone? So it's not as good as proofreading or rekeying. I've found typically 2,000 replacement lines per volume, this method with the first version, and it's somewhat better than that with a revised version that looks within the line and is slightly smarter. The one in the paper only does a whole line because it made the script too complicated to explain. This is massively faster and cheaper than proofreading, on the other hand. I've searched for some other books. I happened to pick up a dictionary of architecture cheaply in a bookshop in Ontario recently for $5 or $10 from 1840, and there's a dozen versions of that on archive.org. So They're still doing it. It's still happening. And since I downloaded all these files for the Chambers Biographical Dictionary, I see just in the last week another set of 32 files has been added. They're actually not very good. They're from India, which isn't why they're not very good. But these particular ones are not very good because they're just images in PDF. There's no text. It didn't actually do the OCR. And that's a project at the University of India, which is why I mentioned where it came from, that there's doing a lot of that. So you encounter that a lot. What am I doing in the future? A few things, such as trying to find, I've already identified, I think, all the poetry by the fact that it's indented. But Greek comes out as random letters and sometimes random italic letters, or with underscores or random capital letters. Context-sensitive fixes is things like, if we're talking about someone who lived in Oxford and went to the University of Oxford, and then 2/3 down the page we have the University of Orford mentioned, we've got a good idea that it doesn't mean Orford, it means Oxford. For one thing, although there is a town called Orford in England, it doesn't have a university in it. So that would be a clue, but in general. So trying to do something kind of situational semantics-based a little bit, but that's ongoing research. And one of the steps I haven't mentioned before is the final step that I do before publishing is I run a script that I wrote a long time ago that that adds cross-references. It adds links, even where they're not marked in the XML. So if it finds someone's name and that name is a head word in this dictionary, then it makes it a cross-reference. If it's a name in any of a dozen other reference works that I have, it makes it a cross-reference. And sometimes they're wrong. It just adds to the fun, right? And, improving the checks back is something I'm still working on. I've done quite a lot of it. So one of the encyclopedias is from about 1900. I would like to have an earlier one that's more contemporary with this, but 1900 encyclopedia. And it marks population of places. So if we've got a person name with a population, that's an error, and I don't do the link. So it's all about lots of little checks. Okay. And on tomorrow, I will talk, in my talk about W3C and IDPF, I'll talk a bit about where books might be going as a result of this merger and ebooks, and some of the ideas about how you contextualize books and kind of explode them and do some of that stuff. And I would like to use this as a test bed for that. But I think you can, there at the top link there, if you can read it, I apologize for the low contrast. The top link is to the actual dictionary. The bottom link, the middle link is to words.fromallbooks.org/XML. That is where this stuff will go. It was too big to upload during the conference. If I include all the text, there's several gigabytes. And didn't seem right to do that in the middle of the conference. There's 150 versions of the, 150 text files and all sorts of stuff. And I think, well, I'll just put it all there. But okay, I guess that's.
Thank you.
Sent everyone to sleep.
Any question? Oh, yeah, over there. Okay, bring the microphone.
Liam, it strikes me that what you're dealing with has got a pretty regular typographical geometry basically involved in it, and that's not terribly complex from that point of view. If you want to go a little bit further, I can recommend that you look at the work that David Brailsford did, which is reported on in ACM DocEng, where he's tackled the problem of reproducing, using trough actually, the births and marriage and death registers from printed material, which goes and explores when the thing gets a little bit more things with tables and that sort of stuff. Some really excellent work that he's done there, which he should do, given his background. So I suggest strongly you look at that work and give you the references.
I will, thank you, yes. I should say also, I haven't really shown you any of the more complex things, such as the fact that footnotes are in 2 columns in the book, and the OCR doesn't actually understand that. So you get alternate lines of footnote next to each other with just a 2-space gap between them, or sometimes a 1-space gap. And sometimes I can undo that and sometimes not. The alphabetical order is not, in fact, perfect in the books. So my scripts check it, and it took me quite a while to get past that, the putting exceptions in. So it's slightly less regular than it sounds, but we don't have any tables in this, thankfully. That's true. Okay. I think are we out of questions? Good, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I had one last question. Why isn't open source the code?
I'm sorry?
Why the code is not open sourced?
Well, it will be. You'll be able to download it. I
Okay.
thought of putting it on GitHub, but I didn't want to deal with pull requests.
Okay.
But I would happily do that if anyone is interested. I will happily do that.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'll just make it available for download.
Super. Thank you. So next presentation. You start.